This talk is part of an ongoing series called This Is How We Do It, which features Jewish museum curators speaking about the process of developing exhibitions, essentially to give a behind-the-scenes look at how a show goes from idea to reality. Speaking today is Rebecca Shaykin, Associate Curator at the Jewish Museum. Since joining the museum in 2010, she has worked on numerous exhibitions, including Helena Rubinstein, Beauty is Power, Masterpieces and Curiosities, Alfred Stieglitz's The Steerage, Roberto Burle Marx, Brazilian Modernist, and The Radical Camera, New York's Photo League, 1936 to 1951. She also organized commission projects by the graphic designers Sagmeister and Walsh and the fashion collective 3 is 4. Before her tenure at the Jewish Museum, Shaykin worked at the Elizabeth A. Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum and at the Williams College Museum of Art. She received her BA in Art History from Oberlin College and an MA from the Williams College Graduate Program in the History of Art. Now, if you can please take a moment to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Rebecca Shaykin.
Thank you, Jenna. Thank you all so much for being here today on this cold, rainy day. Really appreciate it. Louder. Okay, that was going to be my next question. Can everyone hear me? And the answer is no. Okay. Is this better? Great. Okay. I know I can always count on the audience here to shout at me if I'm not being loud enough. So please continue to do so. All right. So what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about the exhibition for those of you who maybe haven't seen it yet. Just give a kind of brief overview for the kind of first half of my talk. And then in the second half, I'm going to kind of go back and talk about where the idea came from, how the idea came to fruition, a little bit about the curatorial research process, and if we have time, some of the design. So without further ado, let's begin. So few people have been so important to the history of American art and yet so little known as Edith Gregor Halpert. In 1926, at the age of 26, Halpert founded the Downtown Gallery in New York City. From a modest space in Greenwich Village, she propelled modern American art to the forefront of public attention at a time when the European avant-garde still enthralled the world. The list of exceptional artists she championed is long: Stuart Davis, Jacob Lawrence, Georgia O'Keeffe, Yasuo Kuniyoshi, Ben Shahn, Charles Sheeler, and dozens of others. Halpert, herself an immigrant, a woman, and a Jew, saw the diversity of American artists and their eclectic creative styles as powerful expressions of the nation's democracy. Embracing the idea of pluralism, she forged a radically inclusive definition of American art that is still in use. Halpert also mined the country's past for hidden treasures. She rediscovered many neglected painters of the 19th century who are now considered canonical, including William Michael Harnett, Edward Hicks, and Raphael Peale. Perhaps most unexpected was her delight in the genre of folk art, then almost unknown. Its popularity today is due in great part to her enthusiasm. But Halpert had more than just a good eye for overlooked talent. She was also a pioneer in art marketing. By cultivating patrons with an interest in culture and the means to support it, she influenced many of the nation's great public art institutions. Today, her entrepreneurial spirit is present in the collections of museums across the United States, even if her name is absent from their walls. With her endless energy and her extraordinary business acumen, Halpert inspired generations of Americans to value the art of their own country in their own time. In 1926, when Halpert opened the Downtown Gallery at 113 West 13th Street, and that's a picture of what the brownstone looked like back in the 1930s, most New York art galleries were in Midtown Manhattan. Furnished in red plush and mahogany, they cater to an elite clientele, primarily showing old masters and French impressionists. Halpert, on the other hand, preferred bohemian Greenwich Village, where artists lived and where customers of all income levels would feel welcome. Her gallery was different in other ways, too. Its rooms were modern and stylish, and the artists she showed were often young and radical. At first, she simply called her venture Our Gallery, signaling the democratic nature of her enterprise. Her motto was simple: Our Gallery has no special prejudice for any school. Its selection is directed by what's enduring, not by what is in vogue. At 26, Halpert was already a successful businesswoman with a background in marketing at Macy's department store and a lucrative career as an efficiency expert at a bank. With her experience, the downtown gallery quickly attracted serious collectors, most notably AbbyAldrich Rockefeller. Under Halpert's direction, many of her patrons went on to build new museums or donate major collections of American art to public institutions across the country. Although she enjoyed these relationships, Halpert never lost sight of her most important clients, everyday men and women who simply loved art and wanted to live with it. She set affordable prices and offered installment plans, sales strategies familiar in merchandising but was unheard of in the rarefied art world at the time. She refused to perpetuate the snob appeal of collecting. American art, she believed, belonged to the American people. And I just wanted to kind of fast forward to this is one of my favorite items of ephemera in the exhibition. It's a brochure from her 1950 Christmas sale. I know this is the Jewish Museum, but Christmas sales every year. And the advertisement, it reads as a rebus. So if you read the illustrations, it says, instead of a diamond ring or a limousine or a fur coat or a TV set, why not give a painting by any number of downtown gallery artists you see listed in the frame? And prices range here from $25,000 to $5,000. Now, this is 1950 prices, so when she was starting, probably the cost of paintings were much lower, maybe starting at even $5 or $10 and going up to $100 maximum. So a jaunty ad like this really showed that contemporary art could and should be treated like any other popular commodity, and that it was often more affordable than other aspirational goods. So Halpert's first display at the Downtown Gallery was a group show. And the two main works in this exhibition, Margaret Zurich's luminous tapestry, Memories of a Summer in the White Mountains, and Ellie Nodelman's whimsical Seated Woman, are reunited in our show here. Halpert intended the Downtown Gallery to show innovative American artists. Interestingly, many of those artists, including Zurich and Nodelman, drew inspiration from American folk art. Halpert soon launched a robust and innovative schedule of exhibitions that quickly solidified the Downtown Gallery's reputation as the most exciting place in New York to view contemporary American art. When Stuart Davis's early experimental works made their debut at the Downtown Gallery in 1927, they caused an uproar. Halpert recalled with satisfaction, people wanted to break the windows. They would come in from the street and scream, "This is indecent, having these crazy pictures." Davis shared her commitment to bringing modern art to everyday audiences. He commented, "People who are up to date in their clothes, automobiles, apartments, and love affairs must buy this type of picture in order to be consistent." So unfortunately, the public did not yet agree, and Halpert did not sell a single work from Davis's first show. But through perseverance and her unwavering support, Davis would come to be one of her most successful artists in the decades that followed. And this painting, of course, is now became part of the founding collection of the Whitney Museum's collection, which had not yet begun when the Downtown Gallery was when it opened. So not all art was difficult to sell. Halpert had her first runaway success in 1928 with a sweeping survey of American landscapes going back to 1848. Her intention was to demonstrate that painters of the younger generation could hold their own against venerated American masters. Because she did not otherwise deal 19th century American art, Halpert sought loans from friends. Winslow Homer's Shark Fishing, she borrowed from an unidentified private collector through a mutual acquaintance. She hung this riveting watercolor in an alcove alongside an early mountainscape by John Marin. A huge amount of interest was generated in the Homer. One visitor offered a phenomenal $10,000 for it. But to Halpert's dismay, she was told the anonymous owner was not interested in selling. So instead, she made up her mind that she would sell the Marin to the person who already owned the Homer to keep the two works together. A few days later, a woman came into the gallery, casually inquiring about the Marin watercolor. Halpert lamented, "It's not for sale. I'm holding it for the idiot who refused to sell the Homer for so much money." The woman replied, "I am the idiot." So that idiot was AbbyAldrich Rockefeller. And the two spirited women became fast friends. And this is a story that Halpert would repeat over and over. And it's actually also featured on our audio guide. So I encourage you strongly to, I try to tell the story as best I can, but hearing it in Halpert's own recollection is really wonderful. Rockefeller became the patron saint of the downtown gallery in its early years, and in turn, Halpert became her most trusted art advisor. In her first year as Halpert's client, she spent more than $20,000. Rockefeller, quite surprisingly actually, did not make big, expensive purchases. Instead, she preferred to buy small works, watercolors, drawings, and especially prints, by multiple artists, so that her philanthropy could assist as many people as possible. So in addition to the John Marin watercolor that we just looked at, also the Martin Hartley seashell and the Georgia O'Keeffe white flower, which is a quite intimate painting, were among some of her early purchases from Edith. Halpert soon began to encourage Rockefeller to turn her personal passion for collecting into a public good. And Rockefeller was already thinking along those lines. And in 1929, she co-founded the Museum of Modern Art, where she would be able to exhibit and eventually donate the kind of art she felt deserved attention. Ultimately, the bulk of Rockefeller's modern art collection, a staggering 2,000 works, was given to the museum, and of these, more than 500 had been purchased from Edith. So about a quarter of her collection came from the downtown gallery. Through her connections to the Rockefeller family, Halpert became intimately involved with the decor of Radio City Music Hall. The Rockefeller Center complex was built at the height of the Depression, and Halpert was able to steer many much-needed commissions for the flashy Art Deco theater to her artists. The two murals pictured here are still in place. Kuniyoshi's mural for the Ladies' Lounge, a dream garden based on a concept by Georgia O'Keeffe, and Davis's 17-foot cubist painting for the Men's Lounge is filled with emblems of modern masculinity. These are really fun. If you go on a backstage tour at Radio City, you get to see both of them, no matter your gender. William Zorach was charged with producing an enormous figurative sculpture for the lower lounge titled Spirit of the Dance. Cast in polished aluminum, it depicts a dancer at the finale of her number. So although female nudes in art were hardly new, and Radio City would soon be home to the leggy Rockettes, this particular nude offended the theater's owner, Roxy, who demanded that it be removed just a few weeks before the grand opening. Halpert, for her part, worked the situation to her advantage, placing the original plaster version of the controversial statue on view at her gallery and opening her exhibition a few hours before curtain time the night of Radio City's debut. The press reported that crowds of sober and indignant art lovers came in droves to see what all the fuss was about. Spirit of the Dance was eventually restored to its rightful place in the music hall where it graces the Grand Lounge today. Charles Sheeler joined the Downtown Gallery in 1931 and was one of her most enduring artists. Like Halpert, he was attracted to the simplicity and fine craftsmanship of folk art. Americana, which you see here, depicts Sheeler's home in South Salem, New York, which he had filled with Shaker furniture and early American rugs. He said, "I don't like these things because they are old, but in spite of it, I'd like them even better if they were made yesterday." He drew a connection between the flat patterns, subdued palette, and strict geometry of chairbacks, fabrics, and backgammon boards on the one hand, and the semi-abstract aesthetics and distorted perspective of Cubism on the other. Despite her focus on contemporary American artists, like Sheeler, especially those with a strong modernist bent, Halpert was a long-standing admirer of American folk art. And in December 1931, shortly after she started supporting Schuyler, she launched the American Folk Art Gallery on the second floor of her 13th Street brownstone, above her modern art showroom. Its first exhibition, American Ancestors, offered work by obscure and self-taught painters of the late 18th and 19th centuries. Halpert presented these works not as sentimental heirlooms or historical curiosities, but as fine art. In the dozens of folk art exhibitions that followed, she resurrected many long-forgotten figures and established them as the forebears of her modernists. American artists, she argued, owed no debt to Europe. Rather, they had their own rich vernacular traditions from which to draw inspiration. Halpert saw no conflict between folk and contemporary art. Modern artists and folk artisans often used similar visual strategies, strong silhouettes, flattened perspectives, and a deliberate crudeness of form. For visitors perplexed by modernism, folk art was a polar inner, she called it. Halpert taught Americans to see both as real art, worthy of aesthetic contemplation and museum display. It is startling to realize that when Halpert opened the American Folk Art Gallery, most of the now beloved classics of the genre were still unknown to the public. Edward Hicks, one of the great American folk artists, was almost entirely unknown until Halpert showed one of his Peaceable Kingdom paintings in her American Ancestors exhibition in 1931. I'm sure many of you, the scene is very familiar. Hicks painted over 60 versions of this Peaceable Kingdom, and they're in major American art collections across the country, and a good number of those passed through the downtown gallery before landing up in their current homes. Another canvas, depicting an expertly painted hanging cloth, stood apart from the others for its unusually sophisticated and seductive use of trompe-l'oeil. Here, the white cloth is rendered so realistically that one is tempted to reach out to remove it to get a better look at the bather hiding behind it. When Halpert bought it from a Connecticut dealer for $75, it was a grimy, nearly illegible canvas that had been passed over by all the major art dealers in New York. It was only after Halpert sent it to be restored was the signature of the Raphael Peale revealed and his hidden Venus along with it. This is another really wonderful story that she tells on her audio guide, so I'm going to send you over there to get all of the full details. It's really fun, and this painting now is, of course, like a cornerstone of the Nelson Atkins collection, and she sold it directly to them when they were just starting out in the early 1930s. So throughout the 1930s, Abbey Rockefeller remained Halpert's most reliable client for both modern and folk art. But in 1938, the Rockefeller family downsized from their townhouse to a Park Avenue duplex, and Abbey Rockefeller was forced to curtail her collecting. The following year, she began to donate her beloved folk art collection to the public, eventually giving more than 400 objects to Colonial Williamsburg, where they would form the basis of the first public museum dedicated exclusively to American folk art. With this new enterprise in mind, Rockefeller made one last major purchase from the downtown gallery, spending thousands on a group of paintings that included the Goya-esque Boy with a Finch, one of Halpert's most remarkable folk art discoveries, as well as these charming wedding portraits. And all three of these paintings are on view in our show here. Rockefeller wrote to Halpert, "You have made a real contribution to the understanding and knowledge and appreciation of early American painting in this country, a contribution which I personally think no one else was prepared to make." So now that Rockefeller was no longer actively collecting, Halpert needed a new source of income. And in April 1935, a scout in Philadelphia brought Halpert a canvas that stopped her in her tracks. Every detail of this unusual still life, from the cracks in the gun's ivory handle to the creases in the newspaper clipping pasted below it, is recorded with virtuosic precision. Almost nothing was known about the artist, whose name was painted in the corner as though it had been carved into the wooden panel. A little tricky to see here in reproduction, but when you go into the gallery, you'll see it's uncanny. Halpert promptly offered the painting to the director of the Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford, Connecticut. She knew Harnett's work would appeal to him. Chick Austin Jr., that was the name of the director, had staged the first surrealist exhibition in the United States at the Atheneum in 1931, and Halpert saw in this hyper-real work, with its intent focus on a single, implicitly violent object, a certain affinity with Europe's latest radical art movement. The sale was swiftly negotiated. Halpert began to exhibit Harnett's work regularly, and a mania for his paintings ensued, with buyers across the country clamoring for his work. He was the biggest sugar daddy I ever had, she quipped. So Halpert's success in selling folk art, and Harnet's work in particular, gave her the funds to move uptown, closer to where many of her clients worked and lived, and to the established galleries clustered around 57th Street. In 1940, she relocated to East 51st Street, so she was able to retain the downtown gallery name while asserting her arrival among the leading dealers of New York. The rooms here were sumptuous, with modern flourishes. The walls were covered in metal-lush, a fine metal netting that Halpert invented and patented, which was both decorative, as it shimmered, you can kind of see that effect here in the photograph, and it was also practical, as it concealed nail holes, so she was hanging shows about once a month, and she didn't have to worry about plastering over those holes. The 1940s marked a general shift in the city's gallery scene. During World War II, and in the prosperous years after, everyday Americans began to purchase contemporary art regularly. Young professionals with progressive tastes and disposable incomes appeared. Many of them were Jewish. In 1944, Halpert reported that almost half her sales were to clients making a first art purchase, a major change from the early days when she had to rely on the generosity of just a few open-minded heiresses and industrialists. For example, among Halpert's most dependable clients at mid-century were Milton and Helen Kroll Kramer, a Manhattan couple who purchased small pictures on installment from her. With thrift and intelligence, they amassed a collection of more than 150 works, including Davis's study for ready-to-wear, which, for those of you who've seen it in the gallery, I mean, it's really small. It's about that big. Although individual works may not have been the biggest or best by any artist, together the ensemble created quite an impression in their home. And like so many of the great private collections Halpert helped to assemble, the Kramers' artworks were later donated to a public museum. In this case, the couple had connections to Cornell University, so it went to the University Art Museum in upstate New York. In 1950, Look magazine published an article about the Kramers' Big Little Art Collection, which they had purchased for $50 a month. In the 1940s and 50s, Halpert used clever frameworks to encourage middle-class Americans to buy art. Gimmicky as these concepts may have been, they signaled that the downtown gallery was neither elitist nor intimidating. Perhaps Halpert's most witty sales scheme was aimed at married couples. It was said that in 1952, 67% of American adults were married, so she staged Art for the 67%, which displayed two artworks by each artist in the show, one for Mr. and one for Mrs. And both could be lent on approval, so the pair could duke it out at home over which one they wanted to keep. And if Halpert was lucky, maybe they would keep both of them. It's just fun. Peter Bloom's South of Scranton was included in one of Halpert's most remarkable marketing stratagems. This painting had won the prestigious Carnegie Prize and had been exhibited numerous times, published everywhere. It received great critical acclaim, but it did not sell. Perhaps because the enigmatic, almost surrealist scene with its homoerotic undertones was unpalatable to many potential collectors. So Halpert featured it in a 1941 exhibition she titled, "What is Wrong with This Picture?" It was a group show of paintings that had failed to find a buyer, a circumstance she commented that should make the critics and museums and collectors blush. She even handed out questionnaires to her visitors, inviting them to answer the question posed by the exhibition's title. So every painting was listed, and it just said, "What is wrong with this picture?" And she expected everyone to just tell her. This may have been a sales ploy to drum up interest in leftover inventory, but her larger point was that taste is subjective and personal. People should trust their own judgment and buy what they like. In the following year, the Metropolitan Museum purchased this canvas, so it was quite successful. I'll also say that Charles Sheeler's Americana that we looked at earlier was also included in that show. So, vagaries of the art market, what can you do? After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese-born painter Yasuo Kuniyoshi, whom Halpert had been supporting for over a decade, suddenly became an enemy alien. He was placed under house arrest with his assets frozen. Halpert responded immediately, mounting a defiant exhibition of his work. In the press release, she described his life as a characteristic American story of opportunity and success. It is the story of his assimilation and emergence in the American pattern. It is the story of the development of a great talent enriched by the opportunities in American life and in turn enriching that life. It is the story of art and life in a democracy. The exhibition presented 21 paintings, all on loan from major public and private collections, one from each year of his career, including the one you see here. Kuniyoshi later went on to represent the United States at the Venice Biennale. Without Halpert's persistent framing of his work in an American context, it is unlikely that he would have achieved this national recognition in his lifetime. When Jacob Lawrence joined the Downtown Gallery in 1942, Halpert became the first mainstream dealer in Manhattan to represent a Black artist. The Artist Harlem series, which debuted at the Downtown Gallery in 1943, are nuanced, vivid depictions of everyday life in America's most iconic African-American community. His distinctive style draws on the simplified forms of folk art, the patterns of geometric abstraction, and the deep traditions of narrative history painting. The association with the Downtown Gallery and Halpert's savvy marketing made the young painter a national sensation. He was about 25 years old when he joined the Downtown Gallery. "I always owe Edith Halpert," Lawrence said. "I think she is one of the great American dealers." In breaking racial barriers and encouraging her peers to do the same, Halpert played a crucial early role in bringing Black artists into the American art canon. After the esteemed dealer Alfred Stieglitz died in 1946, Halpert capably courted his circle of artists, including Arthur Dove, John Marin, and Georgia O'Keeffe. For years under Stieglitz, Arthur Dove's only buyer had been Duncan Phillips, the founder of the Phillips Collection in Washington, D.C. Now, sadly, Dove passed away shortly after joining Halpert's roster, and he never got to witness the incredible success Halpert had in placing his work in collections across the country. These are just two examples. High Noon, she sold to the Wichita Art Museum in Kansas, and Dawn 3, which now resides at the McNay in San Antonio. So it's just a really dramatic difference from Stieglitz. What he wanted to keep his artist's work in really prominent, sort of elite collections on the East Coast in major cities, whereas Halpert was all about bringing art out into the American public all across the country. Halpert revealed the hitherto obscure artist to the world as, in her words, a pioneer abstractionist whose art anticipated abstract expressionism. Later, reviewing Dove's early non-representational experiments, she found that some predated even those of Kandinsky in 1910, generally considered the first pure abstractions. So once again, she was able to argue that American artists were just as innovative as Europeans. At mid-century, John Marin was considered by many to be America's greatest living artist. His paintings struck a balance between avant-garde, gestural abstraction, and more traditional representation. Halpert tried repeatedly to entice him to join the Downtown Gallery with unabashed flattery. First, she mounted a solo exhibition of his pictures of Manhattan, including this watercolor, to illustrate, quote, the parallel growth of a great city and a great artist. Afterwards, she wrote to him, "I can say without hesitation that you are my favorite artist, American or otherwise, possibly more so because not otherwise. I can also say with all due modesty that I, or the Downtown Gallery, is the logical and only place for Marin." This letter went on for quite some time in that fashion. She eventually succeeded in 1950 when she agreed to construct a John Marin room within the gallery dedicated exclusively to showing his work, so it would always be on view. While Georgia O'Keeffe is best known for her magnified flowers and mountainscapes, Halpert intentionally highlighted her more abstract work, aligning it, once again, with abstract expressionism, which by the mid-1950s was dominating the art scene. In a series of solo exhibitions, Halpert presented the artist not only in a new light, but also to a new generation of collectors unfamiliar with her work. The effort was a success, and O'Keeffe's late career flourished. The painter, who was notoriously difficult to please, was impressed herself. "I have heard it remarked," she wrote to her dealer, "that you are the best salesperson in the New York art world." That was as close as she ever came to a compliment, we'll say. So for years, Halpert had encouraged people to buy art for pleasure rather than for prestige, decoration, or investment, and she followed her own advice. Throughout her career, she had been steadily building a collection of American art herself. In the end, her personal trove included approximately 500 works by some 50 modern artists and close to 500 American folk art objects. But there are lots of gaps, she admitted. You see, I've only bought the things I loved. In the 1960s, Halpert wanted to donate her art to a public institution, preferably in Washington, D.C., and I believe this is a picture of her here in the mid-60s installing part of her collection at the Corcoran Gallery in the hopes that they would take on her collection. But unfortunately, she died before any arrangement could be sort of satisfied. 3 years later, in 1973, her collection was dispersed at auction. And fittingly, the sale was one last marketing sensation for the gallerist, earning a record-breaking $3.95 million. Georgia O'Keeffe became the most expensive living American artist when her poppies commanded $120,000. I know that's just like pittance compared to auction prices today, but at the time, 1973, this was a substantial amount for a work of American modernism. And O'Keeffe remains the highest valued female artist worldwide today. The auction house attributed this spectacular success to the Halpert influence. Her name added value. A work with her provenance was recognized to be of high quality. The continued strength of the American art market, nearly 100 years after Halpert opened the downtown gallery, is a testament to her extraordinary vision and steadfast belief in the value of American art. But Halpert's true legacy lies in the dozens of artists she discovered and sustained who were able to live and make art because of her, in the many women in the arts she inspired, in her fierce support of artists who fell outside the mainstream, and perhaps most significantly, in the thousands of artworks that found their way through her into American public collections, usually without her name attached. If today our understanding of American art is eclectic, diverse, generous in its parameters, and infused with idealism, we may in part have Edith Halpert to thank. So that is a kind of quick and dirty overview of the main works in the exhibition and the sort of overall thesis of the show. So I wanted to switch gears now and just talk for a few minutes about how this exhibition came to be. Because it seems like it's all laid out and, you know, it's kind of obvious once you see it all there. But really, the impetus for this exhibition began with a chance encounter with a book. I came across Lindsay Pollock's biography of The Girl with the Gallery, which was released, I think, in 2006 or 2007, and I read it just about a decade ago, right before I even started working here at the Jewish Museum. I had just completed my master's, and I had focused on American art, 19th and 20th century American art, and was really interested in women in the arts and in gender and identity in general. And yet I had never heard of Edith Halpert at all. And so I was really kind of stunned when I read this biography, which is really wonderful, just full of information. I was just so impressed with her breadth of vision and the artists that she supported and this incredible story. I kind of filed it away in the back of my head. I got a job working at the Jewish Museum. And a couple of years into that job, Mason Klein, who's one of our senior curators here, and I worked on an exhibition about Helena Rubinstein, who many of you, I think, probably saw that exhibition. And Rubinstein also was, you know, a very strong Jewish female cultural figure in the 20th century who, she was not a dealer, she didn't own a gallery, but she was a cosmetics entrepreneur. But she also was a collector and a tastemaker, and had supported a number of artists in her own right. And so her interest was really in European modernism, and her patronage included, getting many portraits of herself painted. This is a selection that we had on view. But also other artists like Ellie Nodelman, and then also very importantly, African sculpture, traditional African sculpture too, which was also something that was not really considered to be art in the early 20th century, and she sort of elevated it and exhibited it both in her homes and also at her beauty salons, kind of taught women like how to think about ideals of beauty differently and have a more expansive approach to that. So this is just another installation shot from that earlier exhibition in 2014. So as I'm working on this exhibition with Mason, I keep thinking about Edith Halpert and the kind of resonance of her stories with Helena Rubinstein's. And in Halpert's case, of course, it was not European modernism and African art, but American modernism and African American art and folk art too, and all these different genres that I never in a million years thought working at the Jewish Museum I would get to to work with this genre. I honestly, like many of these artists are not Jewish. American folk art never struck me as something particularly Jewish in and of itself. And so I was just really excited about the idea of maybe bringing to light an exhibition about a woman who was a Jewish woman and an outsider in that way who really helped to define and expand our concept of what is American art and culture. So I put together a proposal. The first thing you have to do is get your major images together, what are going to be the star maker images in your show, to convince your colleagues and your director that this is a good idea. So I put together a slide presentation, and a fair number of the works that I had kind of learned about through reading Lindsay's biography for a second time, I culled those images and I put them together. And so a lot of those images in that very early presentation, I'm pleased to say, are, part of the exhibition today. But from that initial kind of green light, when they were like, yes, this is a great concept, go forth and put the show together, there was still an enormous amount of research to do. So this is a list here of the about 45 public institutions, museums, and collections that are lenders to the exhibition. So I reached out to all of these institutions, as well as about 40 additional ones that wound up not being lenders to the show. Maybe some works are illustrated in the catalog or otherwise. So just basically cold calling my colleagues, curators, collections managers, registrars at American art institutions across the country to ask them to please search their records. Hey, do you have anything in your collection that has the name Edith Halpert or Edith Gregor Halpert or the Downtown Gallery or the very generic term American Folk Art Gallery attached to any of your objects, and see what comes up. Museum collection databases can be quite spotty, ours included. Some of them are not even digitized at all. So I got several museums who said, all of our stuff is paper files, and you're welcome to come down here if you want to and rifle through them yourself, but we're not doing that for you. It's totally fine. And then there are also a number, we have just over a dozen private collectors who lent to the exhibition too, and contacting them, is sometimes a bit trickier. That requires going through American art dealers or consultants. Nancy Druckman, who's going to be giving a talk here later in January, who's a major American folk art scholar, knows all of the collectors, and I met with her and she said, oh yes, I know where a lot of these Halpert objects are, I can help you out. So, making those kinds of connections and working them as much as you can. And then another facet of curatorial research is going into the archive. So I was also incredibly lucky that Edith Halpert kept extensive records. She was meticulous in her note-taking. She kept everything. And all of her papers were given to the Archives of American Art. She was one of the first to give her records, the Downtown Gallery records there. So it's about 100 linear feet of papers, in boxes. And it's exhibition brochures like you see here, checklists, her correspondence with both artists and other dealers and museum directors and curators, et cetera. So there's a lot of information to process from that. But I focused mostly on trying to go through the exhibition brochures and see what were the major exhibitions that she had, what were the big solo exhibitions, what were the big group shows. So this is, for example, a brochure is here, and very helpfully on the cover she would pick a really dramatic work that I could then key in on that and say okay, well, this was the signature work that she had chosen, it must have been important to her, so let me try to see if I can track down those particular works. And so all 4 of these are in our exhibition. The Stuart Davis is now in the University of Iowa Museum's collection. The folk art portrait is in the National Gallery. The Jacob Harlem is in New Jersey at their State Museum. And this Proud Woman by William Steig, which I adore, is in the RISD Museum's collection. So, all dispersed. So kind of trying to reconcile what museums were sending me that was in their collection and what Halpert had presented and what she thought was important at the time. So just to give you a sense, the exhibition checklists that I worked with and the brochures were not fully illustrated at all by any means. This is a really good example. This is Charles Sheeler's first solo exhibition at the Downtown Gallery. And there were only 6 paintings in this exhibition, so not a lot to work from there, but you see that all of them are listed with their titles, but there are no pictures except for the one that's on the cover. And then there were also a few drawings that were included in this exhibition, and they're listed as just drawing, comma, tulips. So you can't really do much with that. But with the 6 paintings that were in the show, those were easily identifiable. Thankfully, the titles hadn't really changed. So I had really been hoping, to get, again, the signature image from that home, which is a painting, or from that show called Home Sweet Home, which is in the Detroit Art Institute of Arts collection. But right around the time I was starting to work on this exhibition, the DeYoung and the Dallas Museum were also working on a major show of precisionism called Cult of the Machine. It's a fabulous show, and it had basically every single Sheeler painting that he ever made in this exhibition. So I think I put out requests for all of these paintings, and most of those institutions came back to me and said, we're terribly sorry, but our painting is going out on loan already for a year, and it needs to come back home to rest or be on view again in our galleries or be available to our students. One of these paintings is at Harvard. But in the end, I got lucky, and the Met came through with Americana, which is great. Very thankful to have this painting. Wonderful one. But it just goes to show that paintings and artworks in general, they lead very busy lives. We kind of think of them as being just sort of readily available. We see them in reproduction so often. I have many more paintings and sculptures that are represented in the book than could be in the show. Not just because of space and our galleries are kind of intimately sized, but also because, paintings have other places to be. A kind of prime example of that is Jacob Lawrence's Migration series, which was the first work of his that Edith had exhibited in 1941 in a major kind of survey of African American art. And this was, the moment that he became famous of showing his work with the Downtown Gallery, and she brokered the deal for the Migration series between MoMA and the Phillips collection, where the 60 panels were split up, 30 each. And that's where they still reside today. Now, many of you may have seen the show One Way Ticket when it was here in New York just a while ago. So actually, this is my installation image of that. So that was in 2015, right as I was starting to put this show together. It was the first time that all 60 panels had been brought together, again, for audiences both here in New York and in Washington, D.C. For 20 years. It hadn't been seen all together. So this work had already kind of recently been shown in New York to New York audiences in a really major way. And then, of course, luck would have it that our Edith Halpert exhibition also opened the exact same week as the new MoMA building, where there are 30 panels from the Harlem series, which you see here on the right, or on your left, sorry, a little backwards, but forms the kind of basis of one of their main galleries that's in and around Harlem. And so that definitely needed to be on view at that home institution. Phillips Collection also this summer had a major show about migration in art from the early 20th century up into contemporary art. So, not everything you want is always available for your exhibitions, and you learn to take a deep breath and make some other choices. So I got to show selections, 4 panels. These are 3 of them from the Harlem series, which was the next series that she showed of Jacob Lawrence's. And I think it's really great. It's really fitting to be able to show this work in New York in particular and to try to reassemble them. These works are much lesser known and a bit closer to home in some way. So just to circle back to this image, which I showed at the very beginning of my talk, the very first inaugural exhibition, this is just one. There are very few installation images of Edith Halpert's shows at the Downtown Gallery. She kept all of her papers and all of her correspondence, but took almost no photographs. So this is a really rare example of being able to see how she was exhibiting her works and what works she was placing side by side. So that was really exciting to be able to bring the Zurich tapestry and the Ottoman sculpture together. But again, like when I'm talking about it in lecture form or you see it in the gallery, it maybe looks as like a complete, like, of course, yeah, just, call up those artworks and send them right over. But it doesn't quite happen like that either. So the Ellie Nottleman sculpture was one that was familiar to me right away. I recognized who the artist was. This was an exhibition also, by the way, that I did not have a checklist for. I just had that one image. I have to go off of that. So I knew the seated woman. Nottleman had done several versions of this, and two are in public collections, one at the Addison and one at the Portland Art Museum. The Portland one is smaller, and they have their, one professional image of the sculpture, neither of which is taken at the angle that I had that other sculpture at. So I spoke with the curators and registrars at both of those institutions, and we were all going back and forth of like, oh, is it our version that's in this photograph, or is it a different one? I think that like maybe the placement of the foot is a little different, or the tilt of the head is not quite right, or the bow in the hair is at a slightly different angle, but it's really hard to tell if you're not seeing the sculpture from the same position. And in the end, it couldn't be determined. There was no exhibition history records for either of these sculptures that could indicate yes or no that it was at the downtown gallery. So I just had to make a best guess, and we went with the version at the Addison. For the other work that was on view behind it, I have to say, honestly, I had no idea what this was. I looked at this photograph for a long time before it struck me as anything at all. I did not know who the artist was, but also as part of my research, I was just doing kind of preliminary, just trying to familiarize myself with all of the artists that I knew she exhibited over the years. And I found myself one day on the website at the Smithsonian American Art Museum for Margaret Zurich, where they have major holdings of her work. And scrolling through, it has photographs of the artist and also examples of her work, a lot of prints. They own a number of prints that I think were given from the estate. And I came across this linoleum cut. And I just stopped and I was like, that looks kind of familiar. I feel like I've seen that somewhere before. And then realized like, oh yeah, that's the central medallion in that like weird painting looking thing behind the Nottleman sculpture that I've been so obsessed with for the last couple of months, trying to figure out which one it was. So then I took out every book from the library that I could on Margaret Zurich. There are not many of them. But one was an exhibition catalog from 1987 from an exhibition that the Courier Museum did up in Manchester, New Hampshire. And both William and Margaret Zurich, their early Cubist years. And in the frontispiece to this one, I got it. I got a picture of that work, and I thought, yes, now I know what it is. Fantastic. Hope it's in the museum's collection. It was not. It was listed as being lent by a Mrs. Alice Crass Lowenheim. I said, great. I wonder what Alice is up to these days. Turned out she had died in 2004. I found her obituary. So this gets pretty personal. There's like some detective work going on here. Finding her obituary, seeing who her survivors are, who survived her. And I had a wonderful intern working with me at the time. I said, I'm at this dead end. I don't know what to do. See what else you can find out about this family. And a couple of days later, she returned this wedding announcement from the New York Times, which is my favorite section to hate read, but now I love to read it because it turned up this great information about this lovely young couple, got married in 2013, and the groom was listed as the son of a Lucy Cohen, who had been listed as a daughter here, one of the survivors, a Lucy Cohen of Maryland. This is a Lucy Cohen who seems to be in Maryland, working as a program specialist at a private elementary school. So I called the elementary school. Asked if there was a Lucy Cohen on staff. They said, no, she just retired. So sorry, but here's her home phone number. So I call the number. It's like crazy. And I don't telemarket. I don't like phone bank. I don't do any of this, but for my job, I have to sometimes. And a woman answered the phone, and I said, "Hi, you don't know me or who I am, or may not know the Jewish Museum at all in New York. I know you're in Maryland, but I'm working on an exhibition, and I think there might have been a tapestry by an artist named Margaret Zurich in your family at one point. Is anything I'm saying making sense to you?" And she goes, "Oh yeah, the Zurich tapestry is hanging in my kitchen." So I was like, "Oh, that's great." And then it turned out that her grandfather had been the founding rabbi at Temple Emmanuel, just a couple of blocks away from here. And so she was quite familiar with the Jewish Museum and the whole New York art world and Upper East Side in general. And she would be happy to lend to our show. So that is the story of how these two works came together in our gallery. Not something you really learn in art history master's programs, but you get it done however you need to. And then I guess the last little detail that I want to leave you with here is just a bit about the exhibition design. Heavy on the Margaret Zurich in the end, but got to support your women artists. So this is just a funny little painting that Margaret Zurich did at some point in the 1930s of Edith Halpert in her blue dress and her cigarette in hand, always with a gentleman client looking at what, I don't know, maybe is a Max Weber painting, hard to say, something sort of Stuart Davis-y behind them. And you'll notice that they're sitting in these bright red, fabulous swivel chairs. Those were designed by Donald Dusky, who was an Art Deco designer who had worked with her on the decor at Radio City Music Hall, and he had also done the furniture and decor for her downtown gallery starting in the 1930s. So these swivel chairs were kind of a staple of her design aesthetic there, and it was just this really nice kind of homey thing where she would sit down with her clients and they would get comfortable and relax and sort of share a cigarette or a whiskey or whatever, and get to spin around and look at the art on all four walls, and she would close in on her deals. So I really wanted to give people that sense, that kind of domestic, homey feel, and that kind of fun and flair that she added to her spaces. So when you go into the very last gallery that we have dedicated to her own personal collection and highlights from that, we've been sure to include some sort of up-to-date modern swivel chairs in that gallery as well. So I do hope that you will take a spin. And that is where I will leave things, unless you have questions, which I am happy to entertain. Yes. Thank you. We need to turn the mic up. Sorry. Yeah, certainly. So the question is more about, I guess, her personal life and who she was as a person, as opposed to just her professional accomplishments, which is what I've really tried to focus on mainly for the purposes of the exhibition and for this talk. Edith was a Russian Jewish immigrant. She was born in Odessa to a fairly wealthy family. But her father died of tuberculosis when she was 5, and she came over to New York and settled in the Upper West Side in Harlem with her mother and her sister. And they wound up losing their money in investments, and so Edith had to get to work at a very young age as a teenager. And so that was part of her kind of work ethic coming up, and then learning those sales strategies from her department store jobs, and then learning how to manage money and people and personalities as a consultant for banks and working on Wall Street. So she was really quite impressive and accomplished at a very young age. She was also an aspiring artist. She, even though she lived way uptown, she clued in pretty early to the fact that New York was becoming a major art center, and she took classes at the National Academy, at the Art Students League, at the Whitney Studio Club before it was a museum. And she was involved with a number of artist organizations and wound up marrying a painter, Samuel Halpert. And we have a portrait of her that I showed right up at the very top by him. Their marriage didn't last for a number of reasons. I think he felt very threatened by her success and the fact that she was supporting him. He was also very sick. They divorced, and he wound up dying just about a month after their marriage ended. So after that, she was a widow and a single woman out in the world working, and the Downtown Gallery was her life. So like people ask about her personal life, like if you really want all of like the super juicy details, Lindsay's biography goes into more of her, affairs and fights and other things like that. But really, yeah, she was married to her work. Yeah. Well, let's wait for the microphone, please. Yeah, she did. She did. The marriage was annulled almost immediately. It's almost like not even worth getting into. Yeah. Kind of a con artist. Yeah.
I should begin by saying that my name is Edith Halpert, and I'm not a relation. Although my grandmother immigrated from Odessa to New York about 20 years before Edith.
Uh-huh.
Halpert was my husband's name.
Uh-huh.
He was not related to Samuel Halpert. But I do vividly remember, at least I think I do, that back in 1959, when Richard Nixon had just celebrated fiction debate
Mm-hmm.
in Moscow, that Edith Halpert was the person who had been asked to organize the exhibition of American art at that World's Fair.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah, that is right. I am just, again, because we're short on time here, I didn't not go into that and those sort of post-war and like Cold War era international relations, cultural projects that she was involved with. But in the penultimate gallery of the show, we have a number of works, both from the Advancing American Art Collection and also the Jack Levine Welcome Home, which was exhibited in Moscow, the show that she was asked to curate, and that caused such an uproar. So yeah, it's definitely part of the show and also part of my catalog as well. So if you'd like to hear more about that, yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so I pitched the idea for this exhibition shortly after the Rubinstein show closed. That was in basically the summer of 2015. Yeah, so I've been working on the exhibition for about 4 years. Yeah.
I want to know where the archives of American art
Are located, yeah.
credentials does one need for that?
That is a great question. So the physical archives are in Washington, D.C., and Halpert's papers, however, they were microfilmed really early on, and then they were digitized from the microfilm. If any of you have been in archives, you know how like helpful or like kind of unhelpful that can be, because the quality of the scan like really deteriorates with each iteration. But so a lot of the research I was able to do from the comfort of my own couch or office, just by looking through the digitized papers. But for whatever was illegible, I needed to go down to Washington D.C. and see the original papers, and other things that hadn't been digitized yet that were very difficult to read, especially any photographs or other documents like that. And the credentials, I don't know what kind of gatekeeping they do actually, but I'm sure it is prominently posted on their website, so you can check that out. Yeah, yeah, you can just Google Archives of American Art, Smithsonian. It'll come right up. Yep. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rebecca.
Yeah. Thank you.